Hello, and welcome to the Let's Talk podcasts. This is your host, Suzie Lewis, speaking from Toulouse. In this episode of Let's Talk, we will be discussing building business ecosystems and how to lead them effectively. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Roland Deiser, Executive Chairman at the Centre for the Future of Organisation, Drucker School of Management. Roland, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Suzie. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. Roland, you are interested in designing and fostering transformational capabilities, exploring boundaries and learning innovation in complex organizations. You founded the Centre for the Future of Organisation at the Drucker School of Management in 2015. You've authored several books, of which Transformers and Designing the Smart Organisation. You also served as founding dean of Daimler's Corporate University and created the Executive Corporate Learning Forum, ECLF, where we first met, a network of senior executives from global corporations to co-create and develop strategic thinking and organizational capabilities. I would like to come back to complex organizations, networks, and interdependent leadership, our favorite topics.
Yes.
And more particularly to the latest project in the Centre for the Future of Organisation, the project on business ecosystem leadership. So, Roland, can you tell us a bit more about this project? Why this subject? And more importantly, why now?
Well, thanks, Suzie, for the very nice introduction. Well, we did a project maybe a couple of years ago, which we were looking deeper at digital transformation challenges. Back then, digital transformation as a buzzword has come a little bit of age, but still was very prominent. And I believe it still is, of course, but it lost a little bit its buzzword character towards ecosystems right now. But if you look at digital transformation challenges that organizations face and that leaders face, a big one is driven, of course, through the digitalization of industries that suddenly, become technology industries where they used to be maybe manufacturing some tools or whatever, but the digital enhancement of products and services makes them technology industries suddenly, which means in order to live their digital transformation successfully, they have to engage in ecosystems much more than they had before because, their product service portfolio is never coverable through that, what they would have in their own capabilities. So that kind of imperative to engage in ecosystems is something which has been driven through digital transformation or digitalization. And that brought us then as one key driver to look at ecosystem leadership in a more kind of focused way.
Yeah.
So that was the history where we got to that kind of thing.
Okay. And you define a business ecosystem as an interdependent value creation network of an organization that reaches beyond its boundaries. So how do you see organizations trying to put this in place? And what does it mean for their current ways of working?
So maybe backing up a little bit, I think that, we always have been living in ecosystems, of course, also before the age of digital, more conscious or not. The main, let's say, management model of the 20th century, though, has been a transactional one and the linear one. And in many cases, it still is, which means, it's driven from the inside out. You develop certain kind of products and ideas and you throw them over the fence and hope it works in the market, or you throw them out and try to push them into the market. And your supply chain and your relationship to the customers is rather a linear one.
Yeah.
Whereas in an ecosystem thinking, those are interconnected clusters that jointly as a network create that value with players who are not dependent on each other. They are, of course, as well, but they are interdependent, which means there is much more a collaborative and co-creative nature of the way they do business together. And so the capabilities in order to perform well and effective in such a mindset or in such an ecosystem kind of environment are very different because in the traditional organizational model, you would be able to command and control more or less your kind of processes and, the products and services you develop and then you throw them out. Whereas if you go into a co-creation and to kind of a networked way of production, you lose control in the traditional way. You've got to negotiate a lot. You need different contractual agreements and so on and so forth. So the mindset is some mindset that requires a systems thinking rather than just your own, kind of organization or your own function being the center of the universe.
Mm-hmm. I'm hearing a big shift in paradigms in terms of mindset, but also in terms of business processes and business models and the way systems interact today. In your research paper, you underline 12 leadership challenges to leading these business ecosystems. Can you tell us a little bit more about those challenges and which are the most important for you?
Yes, so, it's kind of hard to structure that. And we struggled for a long time. Yeah, we struggled for a long time to get this into kind of a categorization. And even in our research report, we currently just list them in an order, that doesn't really have a deeper structure. But what we try to do is to distill some key elements that are necessary to compete successfully in business ecosystems. And we are actually just kicked off a follow-on project of getting these capabilities into even more structured framework. So without any kind of preference, which is more important or less important, I can certainly allude to a few of them. We already talked about, for instance, the understanding of network dynamics, which is very different than just understanding your own organization. I mean, there's been done a lot of work in understanding the networks dynamics within an organization. This has been on the list for quite a while, and people understand, inside we got to collaborate, in agile teams and so on and so forth. But very often this remains within the organization, or if it goes outside, let's say you involve customers or suppliers or other stakeholders in order to you create your agile way to create, for instance, new products and services. You still do it from the perspective of maximizing your own performance, maximizing your own value as an organization. In an ecosystem mindset, you would maximize the performance and success of the ecosystem. That means of the larger system. So if you, let's say, are a big major player, you might only contribute a marginal element to an ecosystem, and you might be frustrated because you say, we could do so much more. But if you would throw this all in, you might destroy the actually business model of the ecosystem, and it wouldn't work that way. And understanding these dynamics is very hard to do because it means you have to take your own interest back in the interest of the larger system. And, if you think about it, this, of course, is something which is also applicable on a much, much larger scale. We have to take back our interest, even as, humanity, in order to understand that we live in a larger ecosystem, which is the planet. And if we take our own interest as the ultimate goal, we might destroy that planet. So this notion of understanding that if you maximize your own interest, you're destroying the conditions of your existence is something we're not very much used to. I did some work way back. I think it was really more than 20 years ago in a piece saying that we evolve as humans also from a very centric perspective to an increasingly, they say, decentered perspective. You think about, the Earth was the middle of the universe, right? And then the sun was heliocentric, and then our solar system. Eventually, now we know we're just specks in multiple, galaxies, and understanding we're just a speck in a multiple galaxy is very different from, we are the center. And that same thinking goes for organizations. They have a hard time to let go of that.
I was just going to say that's the journey they're on, isn't it? And I think particularly post-pandemic, the necessity to do that in a more determined, proactive way has become more and more apparent. So the shift from individual to collective needs to happen, I'm hearing, inside the organization, but more particularly outside of the organization, so that they can start forming a collective system with which society can work.
It's nice you say that, Suzie, individual and collective. It's really that kind of contradiction which you cannot solve, really. It's not an either or, it's really an and. You cannot give up the individual just in favor of the collective, because you would destroy it in a way, and it's important in order that the system works, right? So this is kind of a structural, how should I say, not ambiguity, it's a kind of a structural tension, a dialectic tension that needs to stay alive is like yin and yang. You need the collective, you need the individual, you need both. Very often we have that either or thinking.
Yes. Yes, it's very much like managing polarities. So,
yes,
where's exactly the middle ground? Where's the middle ground? Exactly right. Yeah. And I think that hybrid model, because it is hybrid, because organizations are particularly individual today, they need to get more collective. But as you say, the other end of the scale, we don't want them without individuals in them, clearly. So that brings me to the idea of managing boundaries.
That's one of the 12 challenges, of course, is the boundary management challenge, right? I personally have always been extremely fascinated by boundaries, by the way, for the same reasons, because the individual and the collective realizes itself through boundary management, right?
Clearly.
And you can think even in very small levels, I don't know if you're married, but, if you're in a relationship, there are individual interests of the partner, and there is the interest of the relationship, the marriage. And, if you maximize each of those, you destroy them, right? If you maximize the interest of the couple, then individuality gets lost. And if you maximize the individual, then, you threaten the relationship. And it's kind of, on a larger scale, true for organizations as well. And understanding what happens in these boundaries and designing them and leveraging them in the way that it's an ongoing learning process, that you change and learn and evolve by, discussing these boundaries and make them sometimes more open, sometimes less open. This is also in ecosystems a big problem. How much IP do I share? How close do I collaborate? How strong do I keep things away from you? And the complexity adding to the boundary management is that in ecosystems, we typically will have very different stakeholders with different operating models, different size, very often different industries, very often different, deal types. You might have a licensing deal versus a joint venture. You might have an ongoing cooperation, and so on and so forth, even up to M&A. That the boundaries you have with the different stakeholders might be very different. So you have to have this whole portfolio of, let's say, stakeholders you have. A portfolio of operating systems means a portfolio of boundary management strategies and so on and so forth, which makes this thing very complex.
Yeah, and I think it's about relationship system intelligence, isn't it? There isn't one leader as such. It's around creating, it reminds me actually at an internal level of empowered teams or agile teams. So creating communities or teams that can then become ecosystems and work on some of the biggest challenges, either inside or outside the organization, which is my definition of a more of a platform.
Yeah. No, I just want to say that, it comes to the governance challenge, which is another one of those 12, where you have in an organization, that has a legal framework, in the constitution, you have also governance, and that's more or less accepted. It's usually hierarchical, and as we are trying to become maybe holocratic and whatever and self-organized, and that all things may happen, they still happen under the governance of an entity that has the ability to shape and design certain kind of hopefully enabling structure, systems, and processes. If you're in the ecosystem, you might have 10, 20, sometimes hundreds of players who maybe claim some kind of governance power, but there is no constitution that would give anybody the legitimate power. So you may have it because, let's say, in a platform, you're an orchestrator. Let's say you provide extremely mission-critical services. Let's say, you're an Amazon and you provide the cloud, and without cloud, the whole thing wouldn't work. And definitely you would have a very powerful position in that ecosystem, but it is not as powerful as a codified governance that is within a legal framework of an organization. So in ecosystems, it's a multi-contractual arrangement that shifts and is fluid all over time. As new players enter, other players may exit, and so on and so forth. And leadership then means very much the ability to act in these horizontal, kind of relationships, which are not supported through kind of a legitimate legal framework.
Mm-hmm.
So that is the big difference.
But I think, distributed leadership is around more horizontal, what I call interdependent leadership, but it's also about managing a shift in the balance of power, isn't it? What role does organizational politics play in that for you?
Interesting you mentioned that. I think that we have a totally underestimated role of organizational politics generally, right? Because, if you look inside organizations, you, of course, have there the politics as well. And it's very interesting. I think that social media and all that kind of, stuff that makes people hear their voice with all the negative thing that comes with it as well, still has enabled us to see informal power dynamics much more than we were able to see them before.
Yes.
You have the formal organization, the org chart. There is the CEO, the senior vice president, that it goes down to, the staff or the frontline people. And then you would believe, well, the powerful person is the CEO because, he's the CEO. And you always look into hierarchical, formal power kind of attributes. But if you do social network analysis and you look, the way people engage and influence each other. I recently saw a chart, of such an organizational network analysis, and having somebody in the middle there, and it was Heidi, the person in the mailroom, who was actually the most influential person because she spoke to everybody, and in her mailroom, executives met maybe and talked about things they listened to. And as we know, there is the formal decision making, but the real thing usually happens maybe if people meet in the hallways or at restrooms, and serendipity happens to come, let's do this, and suddenly it finds its way then into the formal process, of course, but it's generated very often informally. And so if we talk about power, we need to differentiate between formal and informal power systems, and the informal ones being, I believe, the more important than real ones. And now we extend this to understanding power dynamics in ecosystems, and then you see how complex the whole thing becomes, because ecosystems are less codified than organizations. They usually don't have clear org charts. It's something that, in a way, is much more anarchic. The kind of dynamics are less visible. It's hard right now to have organizational networks analytics to apply to an ecosystem, because you cannot even command people complete a survey as you can do within an organization. You usually don't have a distributed kind of data generation and analytical tools because they are sitting inside organizations and not in ecosystems. So that becomes very interesting element of it.
And how do you see organizations navigating those formal and informal power systems to get today? Are there any trends coming out?
On one hand, so if we talk about the organization as a unit and not ecosystem, right? Start with the organization. There is definitely change happening through the technology we have today to understand the designs and the workings and dynamics of networks through that tool of organizational analysis. There is work done by a colleague of mine, Rob Cross, at Babson, who has developed a lot of tools to understand that better. And that tools and this thinking that there is more behind the organization than the hierarchy and the org chart has really entered executive suites, and people started to understand that. If you go beyond that organization, I don't think that we have currently much available. And this is really a green field. This is where we're doing our research right now, is how do you engage as an organization, no matter if you're a startup or if you're a 800-pound gorilla like a Siemens or an Airbus, which you were with in earlier times. How do you engage successfully to make that system not only perform well, be efficient, have an output that works very well, and still keep your own balance between, as you said, individual and collective interests? There is not much out there yet to see.
No, which is exciting. I think that there's not much out there yet, but it's an interesting journey, I think, to look at what are the barriers to successful ecosystem management, because as you say, today we don't know.
Yeah. I mean, we did a survey, which is also part of the research paper you have in your hands, and we found quite a few elements that are barriers. And, one of the main thing, obviously, is and that goes way back to, I think, was it Sharma? Some of these guys formulated, ecosystem versus ecosystem.
Yes.
And if you look at the collective again, or just at your ego. And this tendency, especially the larger organizations get, that they are inward oriented because their complexity leads to bureaucracy. Bureaucracy leads to the phenomenon that you're busy with yourselves. That is something that creates invisible, stronger boundaries to the outside. That is something that really holds you back to engage successfully, because you just don't even have the mind to look outside.
Yeah.
I mean, in a way, Suzie, I just got off a conversation before we got online with a friend of mine out of Switzerland. We talked about, the future of leadership. And we've been talking about this as an old friend of mine since years and years and years. Not much has changed, really. Leaders need that very basic quality that you need in a 21st century organization, which is be curious, look outside, care for what's going on in other systems, co-create, communicate in different ways. This kind of horizontal leadership capabilities have been discussed. I think they become an even more important element if it comes to engage in ecosystems.
And I think for me, they're all facets of learning agility, whether it's the learning agility of a person, of an organization, or of a system. How do you think we can help ecosystems to develop that learning agility? Does it need to start with the individual?
Well, I think it needs both. So if we look at these leadership capabilities for business ecosystems, we look both at people capabilities, but also at organizational capabilities. Yeah. On the people side, I think those are these generic, traits that you would ask from a 21st century leader, which is, be humble, be one who rather asks questions than has the answers, have this kind of openness to know that you don't know, still have some kind of major purpose that you can rest in, so that you're not just a leaf in the wind. So that's, of course, the other side, and so on and so forth. And we could talk about those qualities at length. I think one of them, again, when I go back, is I think the curiosity is important. I think it's very important to go outside your traditional ways of thinking, of your cognitive frames that you have. If you are a marketing person, start to think also in finance, in HR, in strategy, and other functions, and not just in your silo. If you are in an industry, automotive, don't think only cars, because it's much, much bigger than that. And this curiosity, what is going on outside your typical, domain in which you feel safe and feel being an expert, is just not good enough in ecosystems. So that would be on the leadership side. If you look at the organizational side, if you need to engage in this portfolio of different relationships, in this portfolio of different operating systems, in a place where there is no established, legally codified governance, then you need also as an organization change in the way you govern yourself. Because all that agility is something you need in order to even successfully engage outside. Yes. You cannot be a rigid, traditional player and then have the flexibility that you need then outside, connected. Yeah. And so I think all that discussion we have about agile organization, and iterating stuff and having cross-functional teams and all that kind of things is important in order to be able to be a successful participant in an ecosystem.
And I think we're back to the discussion that introversion and self-centricity was one of the most important barriers in the inability to think beyond the current way of doing business. If I take the fact that digital has massively enabled end-to-end collaboration and communication, is there a link for you between the digital maturity of an ecosystem and the way the people or the organizations in the ecosystem manage it?
We have looked not at the digital maturity of the ecosystem, but at the digital maturity of the organization.
Okay.
So, if you are a company And of course, we could discuss what does it mean to be digital mature, right? And
different podcast, different podcast.
Yeah, exactly. But there is one thing obviously which is enabling technological infrastructure. If you don't have that, really hard. If we wouldn't have, that, we couldn't do that kind of conversation right now. So that is one thing. I think the other thing of digital maturity is more the social or there's this socio-technical kind of combination of maturity you need. And it then, folds into what kind of leadership do you need? What kind of governance do you need? How can you have kind of self-organizing, self-editing micro-organizations that, work inside and so on and so forth, and also outside. So if you add all this up into digital maturity, then we found also a very strong correlation between the ability to act successfully in ecosystems and digital maturity. So the more you are digital mature, the better a player you are in a business ecosystem, at least, for most of the roles in the ecosystem. Because how do these participants connect? They need to connect with through platforms, right? Usually. How do they develop products and services? Much of it is digital these days. How is it done? It's done through co-creation. It's done through open innovation and all these kind of things that actually belong to the digital maturity. So yes, there is a clear correlation.
Okay, so I'm hearing technology platforms and the platform mindset, so the shift in paradigm of co-creation and interdependent leadership. Thank you, Roland. Would you have any last tips or recommendations on successfully engaging business ecosystems?
Well, it's really an interesting question because we were also discussing the various stages of an ecosystem, right? You can go and say, well, I have an idea and I'd like to create an ecosystem. And you, Suzie, yourself, we just talked about that you were engaged in creating Skywise, right? Which is a great platform in the ecosystem for predictive maintenance of airplane engines. Now, as Airbus did this, you had a vision, you saw that could be a lot of synergies and interesting kind of cost savings and also performance improvements if you bring together the key players that contribute, to predictive maintenance. So you designed an ecosystem, you had a strategy to select certain partners, you created the kind of infrastructure, they could collaborate there, and so on and so forth. Now, that's very different than from when you're invited, for instance, into an ecosystem.
Yes,
right?
clearly.
So if you're the one who gets invited to the table, the capabilities are very different. You need strategic capabilities, but you need still to understand your contribution to the larger whole. And then, it might happen that there is a life cycle of an ecosystem. When you create it, it's great. We have a lot of energy. We have a strategy. But then, you start to fail on the way. And then you start to try to scale that up. And there was a recent very interesting piece by BCG, by the Henderson Institute, on the failure of ecosystems. And there's so often, in like with M&A or with startups or with many, many other things, the famous 80-85% fail and only 15 to 20% succeed. And what BCG found in their study was that the failures happen during scaling. So it's easy to be excited at the beginning, but
clearly.
Now sustain that whole thing, it becomes much more difficult because then stuff goes wrong and collaboration doesn't work as expected, and so on and so forth. But I think if I want to give a tip, as you said, how to engage best is the first thing, as always with business modeling and business ideas. I think you need a vision, you need a purpose. Why do you do that? You need a kind of an idea of what this ecosystem can produce as a value if you engage in it. As I said, these days, there is often not much choice. They better really start to understand that you need also to change your own organization in order to perform well in an ecosystem. And you just cannot step out and think it works without having all these change imperatives applying to yourselves as well.
And anticipating the move from exciting small project to something more scalable, if I've understood correctly.
Yeah, right.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your thoughts with us, Roland.
It's fabulous. I always enjoy these conversations. Also with you, you bring so much yourself to the table. So that's fabulous.
Me too. Thank you very much. You can find out more about Roland and the Centre for the Future of Organisation on their website, www.futureorg.org or www.eclf.org. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and if so, please head over to iTunes and give us your opinion and rating. So it's bye from me, and see you soon for the next episode of Let's Talk.